When we wrap up a conversation like the one that we had last week about the emotional consequences of poor boundaries, it can feel incredibly validating. We start to see the leaks. We understand why we are chronically exhausted. But Monday morning rolls around, and then we are suddenly faced with the actual reality of changing how we show up in our relationships. And that is where the real friction can really begin. Because finding neutrality and clearing out your internal space is only half the battle. And if you don't build that active structure to protect this newly recovered space, then the external noise of the world, the old family obligations, and the demands of other people will come rushing right back in to fill this vacuum. So today we are going to do a deep dive into what I call the architecture of boundaries. We are moving past the why and we are getting into the actual mechanics of how. We're going to look at this entirely through the lens of complex PTSD, exploring how to design limits that actually fit your current nervous system capacity, how to hold those lines when navigating highly difficult or defensive people, and how to dismantle this heavy guilt that shows up at times and tells you that saying no makes you a bad person.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another full-length episode of Reclaiming Me. We are going to continue our talk today, again, about the architecture of boundaries. And before we really roll out those blueprints and take a look at them, I want to anchor you in 3 core structural takeaways today to hold on to as we look at this architecture. And first, I want to anchor us in this idea that a boundary is never a weapon that's used to control someone else's behavior. It is a self-governing promise about what you will do to protect your own peace. And this is a bit of a reframe for a lot of us who grew up in homes where we felt like we did not have a lot of agency. And maybe even if we tried to enact that agency, it backfired on us. Secondly, when you start building structure within a system that is used to having no system at all, you have to expect the system to push back. And most importantly, I want you to know that this pushback is not a sign that you did it wrong. The pushback is coming from the people most likely that are reacting from you creating a new system in a former structure that was maybe a dictatorship, or if that's too strong of a word, maybe it just lacked a solid structure in place for you to be able to communicate what is okay and what's not okay with you. And finally, we are going to completely throw away any expectation of perfectionism here. Okay. So we are aiming for good boundaries and not perfect boundaries. And I cannot stress this enough, because in the beginning of boundary setting work, you are going to fumble your words. You are going to maybe sometimes have too rigid of boundaries or too porous at times. And that is okay because we are just learning these things as adults, probably for the first time ever. So go easy on yourself. So let's just jump right into the anatomy of a limit. And what I'm going to do here with this segment is really help you identify what I'm calling trauma informed capacity. So, in the theme of architecture, to build anything structural, you have to know what kind of foundation you are working with. And for those of us recovering from complex trauma or maybe a lifetime of hypervigilance, we usually don't even know what our capacity actually is. We are so used to operating in a state of functional burnout that we think that our limit is the point where we completely collapse, dissociate, or have an emotional breakdown. But a boundary should not be used as an emergency brake system that you pull only when you are crashing. In the context of CPTSD, the architecture of a boundary relies on you learning to read the subtle somatic signs that your nervous system sends you long before you hit a wall. And so this is why this work is so much deeper than just thought replacement or using like a general cognitive behavior therapy framework. Not that I'm saying that CBT is bad. CBT is helpful, but standing alone in this work with complex PTSD, it just doesn't do the trick because we have to be able to tune into what's happening in our body. So I've talked about this before, but it's that slight tightening in your chest when one more request is made, or maybe it's the sudden urge to just completely withdraw or numb out because your battery is running on empty. And when we look at our foundational architecture, we usually find that trauma has forced us to default to one of two extreme structural survival blueprints. And this is where I want to introduce the concept of the porous blueprint and the rigid blueprint. So, in keeping with the theme of no door on our house, I want you to think about the porous blueprint as the screen door. So, when we are stuck in a chronic fawn response, our boundaries are completely porous, meaning that we let everyone else's emotional weather, their demands, and their crises blow straight through our living room. And our system is constantly hyper attuned to others, which causes energy leaks and completely losing its sense of self identity because the front door is wide open, it's porous. The rigid blueprint, however, think of that as the brick wall. So, out of sheer exhaustion from being porous or from a primal need for safety, we often swing to the exact opposite extreme, rigidity. And if you've listened to Glennon Doyle's We Can Do Hard Things podcast, she describes herself in the beginning of boundary work as a boundary bully. So a rigid boundary could be described as unyielding, cold, and built out of hypervigilance. So it uses anger, resentment, or total isolation as a shield. It keeps the threat out, but it's also locking out any ability for true connection if that is what is desired. So again, to review, we've got the porous blueprint, which is more like a screen door. So it's like trying to enact boundaries, but also there's just like a lot of ways that you can enter the house still. But then also the rigid blueprint, again, think of it as like, I have now built this fortress, this barrier around my home, and you cannot come in regardless. Neither one are particularly helpful in long-term relational healing or connection. And that's why it's so important to learn your true architecture, because it means stepping away from both the screen door and the brick wall. It means deciding in a moment of, and here's the key phrase, calm neutrality. Calm neutrality. What you have, the emotional, the physical, and the mental space to give, and intentionally leaving a buffer for yourself. You are allowed to have a quota on your energy, and you do not have to wait until you are completely depleted to decide that a boundary is necessary. So, again, this is a big ask for a lot of us who weren't raised with the understanding or foundation of boundaries. We have to do a lot of trial and error with a lot of self compassion to even figure out what is calm neutrality for us. What does it feel like to be neutral in the body? What does it feel like to have emotional capacity, physical capacity, and mental capacity? So, last week, I talked at length about resentment and how resentment is this emotion that I know very, very, very well. And I have been working on this personally with my own therapist for probably the past 6 or 7 years now on my understanding of my resentment, how it shows up in my life, my relationship to it, and most importantly, how it has protected me in the past, but also how it tends to get in the way of my own mental health and my ability to connect with other people. And so turning resentment from a weapon into more of like a compass that guides you is really important here if you too can relate to having a lot of resentment, which a lot of folks with CPTSD are very, very knowledgeable about this emotion. So, again, when we are stuck in a chronic cycle of fawning or overfunctioning, resentment is that internal alarm system, and it just starts screaming because our survival self is trying to just keep the peace at the expense of our own health. And again, resentment is a fierce protective part of us that shows up when our boundaries are leaking. And that is key right there to understand that if you've got a high level of resentment, where could your boundaries be creating a slow leak? But here is the catch. When we start navigating our new architectural blueprints, if we don't turn that internal resentment into a clean external boundary, then the resentment turns inward and it burns out our own nervous system. So, what this looks like in some cases is that we end up using resentment to punish the other person in our heads because we are terrified to state our limit out loud. So, we default right back to that rigid blueprint because building a brick wall of silent anger is something that feels protective in the moment, but it avoids a direct conversation. And I'm going to go back to author and somatics teacher Prentice Hemphill, which I referred to a lot in the last episodes from Monday and Wednesday of last week. And they offer an incredible definition that shifts this entirely. And I'm going to repeat that again in case you did not go back and listen to those episodes last week. Prentice says that boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So when you look at it through that lens, a boundary is not a wall that you build out of anger or bitterness to punish anyone, but it's a bridge. It's a drawbridge, as I was explaining last week, that keeps you safely connected to the world without requiring you to completely abandon yourself in the process. And so resentment tells you where the door needs to go. But Prentice reminds us that a healthy, flexible door with hinges and a functional lock is what allows us to stay in the room without disappearing. And that's really a helpful visualization for some people, that if you're feeling that anger, if you're feeling that resentment towards somebody else and you're just seething with it, then there needs to be a door. And not only does there need to be a door, but it has to have hinges and it has to have some way to secure it when you need to, but not so rigid that it can't open. So, how do we navigate difficult people and system backlash when we're doing this work here? And before we get into this, I want you just to do a quick somatic check-in because this can kind of get activating for some of us, and just take a breath. Notice if your shoulders just crept up towards your ears whenever I introduced the idea of navigating difficult people. Okay, let's proceed. So let's talk about what happens when you actually implement these limits with difficult people. And it's relatively easy to set a boundary with someone who loves you, who respects your space, and responds with care and has their own level of emotional maturity to where they can understand your need for this boundary. As my therapist likes to joke with me, very rarely in family systems work, when we are in recovery, do we go to the person, set the boundary, and then they go, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for telling me. I had no idea you were feeling that way. I'm going to try to really listen to what you just said, and I'm going to make sure that I respect your boundary." We probably wouldn't be sitting in therapy if that were the case, right? But again, it feels so different when you are dealing with people who are highly defensive, who are accustomed to projecting their discomfort onto you, or invested in keeping you in your old survival role of the overfunctioning caregiver. And that's a huge one in current day for a lot of people because they became overfunctioners because they were scared to set boundaries. And so now the roles are changing. So when you start building structure, difficult people will almost always test the perimeter. They want you to stay porous because your lack of boundaries serves them. They might try to use guilt, passive aggressive comments, or even outright anger to make you feel like you are being unreasonable or selfish. And the secret to navigating this backlash is, number one, realizing that you do not need their agreement or understanding for your boundary to stand. And remember what we talked about last week, that boundaries are not for other people. They don't have anything to do with other people. They have everything to do with you. So when we deal with difficult people, we often make the mistake of over-explaining our boundaries, hoping that if we just find this perfect combination of words, then they will finally see our perspective and give us permission to have that limit. But over-explaining is actually a fawn response. So when you catch yourself over-explaining, notice how you are slipping back into a porous state. It's an attempt to soften other people's reactions so we can feel safe. And when you're dealing with a difficult person, here is my rule of thumb. Keep the architecture clean, keep it simple, and most importantly, keep it sturdy. So you don't need a presentation, and you don't need to weaponize your resentment into a rigid attack to prove that you are right. And I'm guilty of that one. State your limit calmly, and then immediately pivot to your own action plan. If they cross that line, then you execute your exit strategy, whether that means leaving the room, ending the phone call, or taking a step back from the conversation. Their reaction belongs entirely to them, and your job is simply to hold your own architectural structure. So finally, in this last segment, I want to talk a little bit about integration, meaning good boundary practice, but not perfect boundary practice, and I am guilty of impatience when it comes to my own integration. So, as a recovering perfectionist, I expect to learn something and then just immediately be able to execute it. So, I just share that with you all to know that it is okay to keep fumbling over this until you get enough practice under your belt to where you feel confident with this. But we need time for integration, especially if we've been living in the logical part of our brain for our whole life, basically, to try to protect ourselves. When those emotions start coming up, that anger, that resentment, we're going to fumble with it a bit. And it's a trap that a lot of us fall into because, again, we have been taught and conditioned to view our lives through a lens of perfectionism. We listen to podcasts, we read books, and we think that a successful boundary has to look entirely flawless. We think our voice can't shake, that we can't feel afraid, and the execution has to be perfectly elegant. And if we stumble over our words or we feel a wave of panic afterwards, then we think we failed. But the architecture we are building isn't about creating this unyielding, pristine fortress. We are building good boundaries, not perfect boundaries. So a good boundary is simply one that honors your truth in that moment, even if your hands are shaking while you type the text. A good boundary is allowed to feel incredibly messy. It is allowed to be awkward. Every single time you choose a clunky, imperfect boundary over a perfect act of self-abandonment, you are teaching your nervous system that you can survive someone else's disappointment. You are proving to yourself that your space is worth protecting. So take another deep breath, everybody, because you are outgrowing your survival self and you are learning to navigate the hard spaces, and you are doing beautifully. So, just to recap what we've talked about today with our 3 key takeaways, a boundary is never a weapon used to control someone else's behavior. It's a self-governing promise about what you're going to do to protect your own peace. And secondly, when you start building this structure in a system that's used to you having none, you have to expect the pushback, but that the pushback is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. And finally, let's just toss in the trash the expectation of perfectionism here. We are aiming for good boundaries over perfect boundaries. And just a final share, my therapist has a framed, I guess, sign or art print rather in her office that says, "Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes." And I can't tell you how many times I've stared at that sign. She has it hanging in the bathroom in her practice. And when I would go in, take a breather, wash my hands, take a break, I would stare at that. And again, it was this like little whisper to me that I could use my voice. And at first, when I started speaking up for myself, my throat would constrict and I would kind of get that sensation of like being on the verge of tears, about to cry. And the more I learned about this, the more I understood that in the throat chakra, if you've experienced trauma, that is one of the first places to be blocked because, again, it is signaling that it was not safe to use your voice. So I have my own framed print now that says, "Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes." And I use that as a reminder for myself that just because I'm having a physical reaction to the boundary setting doesn't mean that it's bad. It means that I'm doing really good, important work. So I just wanted to give that as a piece of encouragement for any of you listening where you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever done." Trust me, it feels that way at first and it will lessen over time the more healing work you do and the more open your throat chakra can become. So if you're woo-woo like me and you're into all the chakras, just know that there's a bunch of literature out there on it that you can find ways to open that up a little bit more. So on Wednesdays, midweek reframe, we are going to be talking a little bit more about good boundaries and not perfect ones. So if you're wanting more content around just C plus effort, as my Truth with Food coach calls it, then you'll want to check that out. So it'll be a short one. And I hope to see you back here on Wednesday. And until then, take care of yourself, be good to yourself, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.